You know, for hundreds of years, people have believed that the inscription on this carved stone here at Slaughter-Bridge in Cornwall marks the very spot where King Arthur fell in his final battle. That wicked day when all his hopes and dreams for his country were brought to red ruin at the hand of his own son Mordred. A lot of historians don't believe it, but I think that's missing the point. You see, the famous familiar tales of King Arthur shine and shimmer in our imagination like sun-showered stained glass. And that single bright shaft of sunlight is sometimes all we remember from those deadly dull history lessons at school. But it shines so strongly that it's led all sorts of people from all walks of life to set out in search of the real Arthur. You know, for what it's worth, I actually think that Arthur really existed. I believe that the legends have grown out of an historical reality, whatever that might have been. But more importantly, I think that something else has grown out of the legends themselves. We're going to look at a forgotten legend that puts one of Arthur's battles here in Cornwall. It's up to you whether you believe it or not. At the end of the day, the legend's going to be intact. The essential truth of the legend is what will always matter more than any of the rest put together. You see, those fragmented fireside tales were first gathered up in the early Middle Ages by Geoffrey of Monmouth, and it's Geoffrey who first places Arthur in Cornwall. Here, at the very last of the land, the very birthplace of the Arthurian legend, is the castle of Tintagel. It's a place where the envious ocean comes ceaselessly to tumble the twisted, tormented slate down into its dark embrace. The day will come when all of this will be destroyed by that ocean. But the Tintagel of legend, the Tintagel where Arthur was conceived and born, the Winter King who brought summer back to the land and its people, that can never be destroyed.
Well, of course, the reason that most people come to Tintagel is because of the legend of Arthur. When they get here, they see a ruined 13th century castle and wonder what that connection is. Well, the connection is quite clear, that the Normans who built that castle were in fact following on in a timeless tradition that stretches right back over the centuries, because Tintagel was in fact an island of ritual significance, a place where the old kings were inaugurated into their guardianship over the land. And many, many features on this island speak of this truth, which was handed down in the Celtic oral traditions and then written down later on in ecclesiastical manuscripts. Right here on the summit of the island is perhaps the most extraordinary feature, because this, although most people miss it, is in fact the whole reason for Tintagel. It is what is known as a footprint, and carved into the slate here is this shape of a man's footprint. One of the interesting things about the choice of this spot for this footprint is the fact that it is on the very topmost part of the island, and beyond here we have the wonderful cliffscape where literally thousands of people could have assembled to watch in fine detail what was happening at this very spot. It is a spot where the king is married to the land. As he faces the seaward side, he's protecting the mainland, and he places his foot in this footprint, which his ancestors, of course, have done many, many times before. And this is the place where you become Arthur. You become imbued with the very spirit of the land. This is a most magical spot indeed.
And for centuries, that magic has tumbled out of the very rocks themselves in a torrent of myth and legend. Tintagel was a place of ancient royal ritual, a place of power, and it still has that power to unite the past and the present, a power that lets us follow in Arthur's footsteps.
Believe me, there's nowhere in the entire British Isles where you could come and step with such ease onto the very bridge that reaches back into time. Nowhere you could come where you would so easily be able to find the Arthur of legend, because here your imagination works with all the power and force of a waterfall to wear away the rocks of cynicism and disbelief that so often stop you understanding the past. Here you could be the one that stood and first saw the raiders. It could be you that set fire to the warning beacon that brought Arthur from his castle and brought the king out to Velendrusha.
In 410 AD, Rome itself had been sacked and burned by the barbarians, and as the whole of the civilized world seemed to collapse in flames, the emperor abandoned Roman Britain to her fate. From now on, the province would fight on alone against the barbarian wolves, the wolves that came howling at her out of the gathering night. And it's there we find the real Arthur, a handful of written references, a mere ghost glimpsed through the fog of war. A moon shadow, wind-driven across the grey grass of the distant past. But legend has made him into a great warrior, the High King who fought and died in the twilight's last gleaming, fought to buy Roman Britain one last hour of daylight before she went down into the long darkness of the barbarian night. The legend of the lost Battle of Velendrusha says that Viking longships descended on Sennen Cove with fire and sword, and that all along the coast from Land's End to Tintagel the beacons flared up, and Arthur came down on the raiders in the Vale of Velendrusha, where he met them with great slaughter and drove them back into the sea.
Now, you might already know this, but back in those days, this sweet little honeypot of a tourist trap was actually a very wealthy and a very important port. And the one desperate hope of its citizens to delay the fury of the Northmen was very quickly dashed. The landlord of the Old Success Inn appeared on the beach and announced to their utter dismay that people were not allowed to drink in his pub unless they were wearing shirts. And besides, he didn't do meals on Mondays. The Danes were not best pleased. They quickly moved inland and proceeded to visit on Cornwall their celebrated impersonation of a mob of Millwall supporters whose team's just been put out of the FA Cup by a non-league side. All this is the valley of Velendrusha. If you come here today, you'll find it filled with the raucous calling of crows. And that's apt, because there are those who think that this is the site of a long ago and long forgotten battle, the Bloody Vale, in which Arthur fought one of his great battles to drive back the barbarians. You won't find it in the history books. You won't find archaeological reports about it. Only local legends. But it wouldn't be the first time that a local legend had guided us back into the reality of our past.
Now, as I go by this stream, the stream is nothing to what this area was in terms of a river. It was way beyond here, quite wide, quite free-flowing. A lot more trees were here. And as I'm moving now in the 20th century, I can take myself back to 1,500 years ago. And the battle was definitely raging here. It was a massacre. And the Britons actually trapped the Saxon raiders in this valley. And they came at them on three sides. They knew they were coming here. They had watched and waited for them for several days. And beyond here, the Britons came down in three, like a fork, three prongs, trapped them in here. There were about 195 Britons and 135 Saxons. I'm getting a lot of problems now which I'm taking on in my body. Psychically, I can feel this terror. Absolutely terrible. I'm sorry, I'm covering up my mouth. It's absolutely terrible. The Saxons have come out of the trees at the end here, and they've sent their first wave in, and behind them are a lot of youngsters. They brought about 35 young men. They learn the ways of the strategy and so on. It's not just a go in there and cut everybody up type of thing. It is really quite organised. So these youngsters are in there, and as these two waves come out, the Britons surge in and cut them to pieces. And they really cut them to pieces. And they move into there, and it's over quite in a short time. It's about June. It's quite warm. In the year 483 AD.
It's interesting, isn't it? The minute anyone starts talking about emotions and feelings, some of us get all embarrassed. Well, the Anglo-Saxon part of our nature gets all embarrassed. So where does that leave us? Was there really a battle here at Velendrusha? Well, something that's worth remembering is that in the Dark Ages, a battle didn't necessarily have to be an all-singing, all-dancing spectacular from the Mel Gibson School of Historical Combat. A man could quite easily be killed in a small skirmish in a place like this. A handful of men who stumble on each other, and then the battle is over as quickly as it begins, and is just as quickly forgotten by the people who survive it. But the important thing is, it's not forgotten by the people whose land this is, the people who then watched the bones of the dead picked clean by the crows and saw those same bones whiten and crumble to dust in the winds and the rains of the long winters.
And that's precisely the tale that's been told and retold hereabouts for centuries. You see, just as the ocean slowly changes the shoreline, time will slowly change the details of a story, and it hides the truth of what really happened. Only a fool would be daft enough to say that nothing ever happened here. Something did, I'd bet my watch and chain on it. But if it happened in Arthur's time, then it can't have been the Vikings. Well, not unless Arthur was leading a full and active life aged 507. But if Shirley's right, if the raiders were Saxons, then that'd be spot on for Arthur's time frame.
Now, it's shocking bad form for a historian, and I try never to make a habit of it, but where King Arthur's concerned, the absence of hard historical fact is something I try never to let get in the way of a cracking good story. And whichever way you cut it, the Battle of Velendrusha is a cracking good story. But if we're still looking for the real Arthur, rather than the legendary Arthur, then we have to have something more substantial than crystals and my gut feelings, however substantial my guts might be. At the end of the day, we need archaeological evidence or written history to take us those last few steps back into the past. So what if there was a historical record of Saxon raiders off the Cornish coast, and of a British warrior king who later pursued these raiders across the Channel to drive them out from their base in Gaul? Could this British king have first met and defeated these same Saxons in Cornwall at the Vale of Velendrusha? And was he, as some people in Cornwall believe, the true and historic King Arthur?
Well, in the 5th century, and when we're talking about Arthur, I think we are talking about the 5th century, there was a Saxon pirate base in the Loire estuary in southern Brittany. And it's twice recorded that during that century, they mounted heavy raids on Ireland. Now, it's inconceivable that they would have travelled from Brittany to Ireland without stopping off at Land's End, which sticks out halfway between the two. And here they would have raided for food, water, slaves, you name it. But the alarm signals went up, the fire beacons on the tops of the hills, and Arthur came down with 9 chieftains and defeated this invasion force at a place called Velendrusha, which is near St. Burian. These Saxon pirates were finally cleared out of the Loire by Gallo-Roman forces under a man named Syagrius, and interestingly enough, by a British force whose help had been asked by the then Western Roman Emperor Anthemius. 2 Gaulish historians, one called Journand, another Gregory of Tours, note that the British king, at the Roman Emperor's request, took 12,000 troops across the sea to Gaul, not only to fight against the Saxons, but against what was then the biggest threat to what remained of the Roman Empire, the invasion of Gaul by Visigoths from Spain and Aquitaine. The annoying thing is that we don't have the name of this king. We only have his title, which is recorded in the British language, Riotamus, High King, Super King, Supreme King. No other British king of the period fought in Gaul. But that's exactly what Geoffrey of Monmouth said Arthur did. And at exactly the right time.
So now here is the finely woven and familiar tapestry of Arthur's life, but suddenly comes this bright, blood-red skein of possibility woven straight across it. The possibility that Arthur didn't die here in England, but he died far across the sea in Gaul. And it gets better, because not only was Arthur betrayed and defeated and forced to retreat from his last battlefield, but the very place that he retreated to is still there today, a place with the remarkably familiar name of Avalon. Oh, and it gets better. Near Avalon are numerous stone sarcophagi, the very large stone coffins of the great and the powerful. And they're empty. Is it possible, just possible, that the story, the legend is true? That after Arthur's last battle, his body was gathered up and carried away? Not to the Isle of Avalon, but from the Isle of Avalon. That Arthur's body was brought back across the narrow seas to Cornwall, the land of his birth.
But with his death, the real Arthur's lost in the vast ocean of legend, the ocean that sweeps aside mere history. No one knows where he was laid to rest, Avalon, Glastonbury, or the lost land of Lyonesse. Some Solonians believe that he lies entombed in the ancient burial mounds on the Isle of Great Arthur. watched over by the Silkies.
Do you know what I think? I think that the quest for Arthur will never end. I think that people will always look for the historical reality behind the legend because it's such an exciting thing to do. And that's no bad thing. Because isn't it often the case that as we're looking for one thing, we actually find something completely different? And that's what happens with the legend. Because as people look for the real Arthur, they rediscover the imaginary Arthur all over again. They rediscover England's greatest legend in all its glory. And then it doesn't matter whether Arthur was really the Rhea Thomas. It doesn't matter whether he fought at the Vale of Velendrusha. And it certainly doesn't matter whether his body was carried off to Avalon in France, or whether it was brought out into the sunset, out into the Western Ocean, to the cold, uncaring Atlantic, to be laid to rest on the island of Great Arthur. It doesn't matter, because if we keep the legend alive here, then the once and future king lives on too. The legends of King Arthur are one of the richest and the most precious gifts that the past has ever given to us. And as long as there are people who will take them up and keep them safe, it won't ever matter that there are some people who simply throw them away.